Hey, welcome back to Doug Pagitt Radio on AM 950 and DougPagittRadio.com. As I mentioned, bumper music brought to you by Love 105. Literally, all but the opening and ending songs. You know, the show opener and the last segment. Mm-hmm. I really did hear on 105.3.
Oh yeah, and you made like a mental note of that?
I got them on my Shazam on my phone and said I'm gonna play those totally cheesy love songs. But that one's called Higher Love. And Bruce Epperly is our guest. Bruce is a process theologian and a writer and an author and a thinker, and we're so glad to have him on the show. Bruce, our my sidekick here on the station, we were on the show. We were talking about these ideas over the break, and he had a question for you.
Sure.
Hey Bruce, I've had been a pastor for over 10 years, but it seems like I've only heard really about process theology within the past couple of years. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think part of it is just accessibility. I've been a pastor myself for some 30 years and have probably spent as much time in the pulpit and counseling and working in spiritual formation with folks as I have in the classroom. I love being a pastor, and I love the whole notion of bringing forth great ideas in congregations to change people's lives. And one of the problems with any theological system is that people get caught up in the words. Whitehead, who's the parent of process thought, really developed a new kind of language because he felt that some of the old languages, the languages of Newton, the languages of some traditional philosophy, while still important, kind of held people's creativity in check. The challenge for theologians is to make the words become flesh. And I've made a commitment ever since I discovered process thought actually as a sophomore in college, and that's been more years ago than I'd like to think. That I would want to make this accessible to people and try to use language that's at least every day to talk about change, to talk about God's love, to talk about how God embraces tradition but uses tradition to move us forward in new and creative ways. And so part of it, I think, also is some of the things that Doug just mentioned, that when you hear about process thought, most of the time people who aren't aware of it think that it goes against the orthodoxy, but of course I always ask the question, which orthodoxy are you talking about?
Yeah, and I do too. I think that's an interesting question because Christianity has always been broad and very evolving kind of faith and a very evolving set of practices. So Bruce, you mentioned John Whitehead as being one of the people who sort of put some new language around this idea of process theology. Is it true, as some of my friends who would hold to a different view on these topics than I do, that really what you're talking about here is just kind of classic early 20th century liberalism? Do you see it as that, or do you see it as something else?
Well, I see it as something more. Came out of the evangelical tradition. I'm a Baptist by background and still honor that. I love the heart religion I grew up in. Mm-hmm. Arminian Baptists who had revival meetings. Lord knows we needed to be revived on a regular basis, I suspect. Right. But also found the faith in a liberal Baptist church, and then discovered that that wasn't enough for me, that I became interested in mysticism and spiritual formation, became interested in reading the stories of the Bible and trying to discern how much of these stories can we still affirm. Yeah. I became interested, I think your wife is interested in this too, Doug, in complementary medicine. And complementary medicine really opened a door to me to claiming the healings of Jesus as important, claiming the power of prayer. Old-time liberalism was still caught up in that sort of one-dimensionality that saw spirituality as being antagonistic to social concern. I see them as necessary. I mean, if you're spiritually active, you need to be socially active. If you're socially active, you need spiritual formation to fight the long battle that seems to go on forever. As the president says, the moral arc.
Yeah.
It's a long arc sometimes.
Yeah, it's very long.
And for me, while Whitehead was certainly part of that tradition, the innovation was that he in his own life lived in the world of Newtonian physics and then quantum physics, blew everything out of the water. And he began to see the world in terms of this dynamic forward push of relationship that affected religion as well as science.
And I wonder, Bruce, if one of the issues at hand here is that you had mentioned, that you could come from a Baptist tradition that had Arminianist thinking, and I know there's people listening to the show that don't follow these categories, but very often you'd have a theological idea that would go with a particular denominational expression and practice. And it seems like one of the issues in process theology is that it calls people to a greater level of exploration and experimentation, and doesn't serve very well to create a closed system of branding.
Yes.
Do you think that that's part of the issue, is that you can't just pick a tradition or a denomination and say, well, here's a place where I know I'm going to get sort of the good old-fashioned process theology?
Sure.
Because we all teach that, because people are called to be more creative beings and generative kind of activities in the world?
I think so. I mean, I belong to a couple denominations, United Church of Christ and the Disciples of Christ, and I've pastored churches in those areas. But both of those denominations, in my mind, have taken on the forward movement too, so that they have a strong tradition, but at their best, they are open to the world, to learning from Christians and non-Christians alike, to experimenting with new ways to be faithful to God, to having the best possible music in the grand tradition, and yet exploring global music.
Well, and that's one of the things I think people find interesting about process theology, is that it really is people who, rather than saying, I want to kind of diminish Christian narrative and I want to diminish the Christian teaching, it's really people who say, boy, if we would really listen to it in some fresh ways, it could be so much more. And people want to be more faithful to God and to faith and to love and to Christian commitment in life, not less. And I think when people hear sometimes the kind of phrases that we've used even in this conversation, they're like, well, so do you not want to be Christian anymore? And do you instead want to be kind of Eastern Buddhist or something? And it's interesting that it's not that at all, even though it doesn't want to make enemies of those folks. It really is about some kind of faithfulness and people being called to that. So I know we only have a minute left. I want to give you a last word, but I also want to tell people that there is going to be a conversation in California called the Emergent Village Theological Conversation, where you and me and a number of other people are going to be there talking about these ideas and a number of others. And I know you wanted to invite people to join us out in those meetings as well.
Well, certainly, and I hope to premiere the Emerging Process book there, but I want to just dovetail on your comments about the conference. I'm going because I believe that Christianity is a dynamic religion. I believe that the grand traditions of worship are important, but the best way to be faithful to those is to honor them, to claim them, and then to be creative in our own time and place, and to have a big story to tell and not a small story, and to welcome the seeker, the spiritual but not religious person, the none of the above, as well as people who are quite happy being in the pews. We all can grow. Doubt is a good thing. It pushes us forward, and we trust that God is with us in the adventure.
That's Bruce Epperly. You can find him at bruceepperly.com and join us out in California. You can go to Doug Pagitt Radio and Doug Pagitt Radio on Facebook, and also to get the details of that. Bruce, thanks so much for being on the show.
Well, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Hey, folks, stick with us. We're going to be joined by Mary from Chocolate Celeste, talking chocolate after the break.
Time to pick my heart up off the floor.
Hello, pet appreciators. This is Kathy Menard, and I'm inviting